Do you truly believe that the money in your pocket, the deed to your house, or the savings you've set aside actually belong to you? For most of us, ownership is an indisputable, sacred, and unshakable right. However, history has shown us time and again how fragile this right is and how it can vanish overnight when the interests of the state are at stake. Today, we will see in the clearest way possible that property is, in fact, nothing more than a temporary permission granted by the state. At Aegis Finance, we are not here to present you with a conspiracy theory, but to confront you with the cold reality of official documents, court transcripts, and economic facts. We will examine that dark period in 1933, in America known as the world's greatest land of the free, when the most valuable asset people owned was declared illegal. One morning, April 5th, 1933, was not just the date of a financial executive order. It was the day that demonstrated how the silent social contract between modern individuals and the state could be unilaterally terminated. If you're ready, we're entering that great war over property where we will question just how secure your vault really is. Try to imagine the heavy and gloomy atmosphere of the early 1930s. The economic monster, known as the Great Depression, had swallowed not only the stock markets, but all of people's hopes for the future. From the glittering streets of New York to rural towns, despair reigned everywhere. The long lines in front of banks were not just for withdrawing money. They were an attempt to reclaim a lost sense of trust. People woke up every morning living in fear of seeing a massive padlock on the door of the bank where everything they had saved for years was kept. The financial system of that era had one vital difference from today. The gold standard. Unlike now, central banks couldn't print trillions of unbacked dollars at the touch of a button. For every paper dollar printed, there had to be physical gold in the Federal Reserve's vaults. This system was a shackle that kept currency honest and prevented states from borrowing limitlessly. However, as people began to realize that banks would fail and paper money would lose its value, that shackle began to tighten around the state's throat. People fled from paper currency and turned to the only true sanctuary that has preserved its value for thousands of years: gold, as the public hoarded their gold-pulling money out of the banking system and stashing it under the mattress. The real value circulating in the market rapidly vanished. The state needed to inject new money into the market to stimulate the economy, but there was no gold left in the vault. At that moment, the system's politeness ended. If the public would not return their gold to the system voluntarily, the state was left with no choice but to take this asset by force. Roosevelt and his team decided to sacrifice property rights under the guise of public interest. This was no accident. It was the savage survival reflex of a system that was trapped and on the brink of bankruptcy. On the evening of April 5th, 1933, that authoritarian voice broadcasting over the radio waves sent a shockwave through millions of Americans. President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced that he had signed Executive Order 6102. The language of the decree was so severe that it shattered the public's understanding of property rights in mere seconds. The order commanded that every individual, every institution, and every association within the United States must deliver all gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to Federal Reserve banks no later than May 1st, 1933. There is a crucial detail here. This was not a call to patriotism. Those who did not comply would be declared criminals outright. The state was telling you, I am taking your real value and giving you these pieces of paper that are under my control, whose value I can diminish at any moment. In exchange, only $20.67 per ounce was paid. By turning the possession of gold into a serious crime, the decree placed ownership squarely in the hands of central authority. An exemption of only $100, about 5 ounces, was allowed. Everything else was now the property of the state. In modern history, there had never been such a sweeping and legal assault on the right to property. When the state issued this order, it didn't just sign a piece of paper. It established a massive mechanism of fear and coercion behind it. The penalty for non-compliance was severe enough to ruin a person's life under the conditions of that era. A $10,000 fine, or exactly 10 years of hard labor in prison. When adjusted to today's economic value, this penalty equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars meant the end of an ordinary citizen's entire life and reputation. The state had launched a war of asset confiscation against its own people. But did no one really resist? This is where the case of James J. Bates comes into play. Bates was an honest citizen who believed that property rights were under constitutional protection. Refusing to hand over his gold, he stated, "My gold is my labor, and the Constitution protects it." When he was brought to court by FBI agents, everyone watched as the rights of property turned into a mere technicality in the courtroom. The court rendered a historic decision when public safety and economic stability are at stake. The rights of the individual fall behind the needs of the state. Bates's case proved that the law only protects you as long as you do not obstruct the functioning of the system. If the system becomes clogged, those laws can transform into weapons used solely to save the system itself. The process was not limited to the threat of imprisonment. The state also used the trust between citizens as a tool for manipulation. Rewards were offered to those who reported individuals who had not surrendered their gold. Newspapers and radio programs conducted an intense propaganda campaign, labeling those who hid gold as economic saboteurs and enemies of society. Neighbor began to denounce neighbor, and worker began to report boss. A climate of fear was constructed, and people began to suspect even those closest to them. Here, one of the most fundamental laws of the financial world emerges. Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good. The state wanted to print money continuously, but gold was a physical barrier to this. Because the public anticipated that the currency would lose value, they were hoarding the good money gold. To break this vicious cycle, the state had to forcibly take that good money from the hands of the people and condemn everyone to bad money, the fiat currency, under its own control. The 1933 decree was designed to physically close all exit doors available to the public. When you have nowhere left to run, you become completely dependent on those pieces of paper emerging from the state's printing press. Gold was collected from the public at $20.67 per ounce. The lines in front of banks ended, and the vaults were filled with the people's gold. So, what happened once this collection was complete? In 1934, with the Gold Reserve Act, the price of gold per ounce was raised to $35 overnight. This was the largest and most organized arbitrage operation the world of finance has ever witnessed. The state increased the value of the asset it had snatched up cheaply from the public by 70% through a law it enacted itself. The real meaning of this figure is this: the purchasing power in the people's pockets vanished overnight, and this massive value was transferred directly to the state treasury. This was a much cleaner and legal operation than robbing people on the street at gunpoint, but it was just as ruthless. The state paid off its own debts using the labor and savings of its people and patched its collapsing budget with the public's money. Today, we give these fancy names like economic reform or fiscal discipline, but the truth remains. The speed at which the money in your pocket changes hands depends entirely on the state's legislative power. At Ageless Finance, we believe this event is the most rational and honest example of how modern states solve their debt. Crises on the backs of the people. Did this harsh law really hit everyone? History shows us that rules are rigid for those at the bottom and flexible for those at the top. Here, we encounter a financial concept known as the Cantillon effect. Those who print the money first, and the elites closest to that money, are always the ones who best understand the system's loopholes and the coming storm. Weeks before Roosevelt's executive order was signed, the giants of Wall Street and certain highly influential families already knew this decision was coming. While ordinary citizens waited in lines at banks to surrender their gold, the gold bullion of some elites had already been moved by ships to Europe, specifically to Swiss banks. The fortresses of secrecy. The law only covered assets within the borders of the United States. Therefore, for those with the power, knowledge, and connections to move their wealth across borders. This crisis was merely a massive opportunity for wealth protection, while the public grew poorer and lost their savings. How names like Rockefeller and major bankers protected their fortunes in safe havens remains one of the largest open secrets of financial history today. The system worked exactly as designed. The public paid the bill, while the founders of the system secured their safety. Many people assume that gold was only banned temporarily. In reality, owning physical gold continued to be a crime in America until 1974, for exactly 41 years. A citizen saving gold was an illegal act punishable by imprisonment. Think about it. For nearly half a century, people were deprived of the ability to control the backing of their own money. In 1971, when President Nixon severed all ties between the dollar and gold, the world financial system transitioned completely to a fiat money order. So, Why was the ban lifted in 1974? Because gold was no longer a threat to the state. The dollar was now a completely unbacked piece of paper, relying solely on the word of the state, and the state could now print as much money as it wanted. They set gold free because even if the public bought gold, it could no longer prevent the state's power of limitless borrowing and money printing. This was not the return of freedom, but a sign that the system no longer needed an honest anchor like gold. Control had been fully established. For 41 years, property rights were suspended, and during this time, an entire generation grew up in a world where the value of their money depended solely on the mercy of politicians. Now, let's set the past aside and look at today's world, standing on the edge of a massive $38 trillion debt abyss. Today, the FBI doesn't need to go door to door to seize physical gold. More than 90% of our assets are now nothing more than numbers and digital footprints on bank servers. The CBDC, Central Bank Digital Currency, systems that central banks are currently developing are dangerously close to becoming a digital replica of the 1933 executive order. In a world where cash is completely eradicated, your property is merely a data entry subject to the permission of a central authority. With a single keystroke, the state can freeze your account, restrict your spending under the guise of carbon footprints or social credit, or silently erode your savings through negative interest rates. In 1933, people at least had a chance to bury their gold in the ground or hide it physically. Where is the ground for your digital wallet? If your wealth is entirely imprisoned within the servers of a centralized system, is that asset truly yours? Or is it just a usage subscription provided to you by the system? At Ageless Finance, the point we want to emphasize is this. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. The physical confiscation of 1933 can be executed today with a digital code much faster, quieter, and more flawlessly. This is exactly where we begin to understand why. Bitcoin and decentralized assets are under such heavy attack. Bitcoin is the digital antidote to Executive Order 6102 for the first time in history. There is a means of ownership that states cannot seize, cannot devalue with a single click, and cannot steal through inflation by printing limitlessly. If the people of 1933 had an exit door that the state could not control, financial history would be written very differently today. Today, we must read the state's pressure on Bitcoin, exchange regulations, or money laundering narratives through the spirit of 1933, an asset that cannot be controlled, frozen, or confiscated is the greatest existential threat to a system that seeks to sustain itself through limitless borrowing. That same centralist mindset that criminalized gold in 1933 is today marketing any form of financial freedom outside its control as a threat of chaos. However, technology is no longer as helpless as it was in the 1930s. The war for property is now being fought, not just with laws, but with unbreakable codes and mathematical truths. As we reach the end of this video, we must ask ourselves this crucial question. What do we actually own? If the value of a piece of paper or a digital number on a bank screen relies solely on the promise of those who manage that system, that value can evaporate at any moment with a single decree. What happened in 1933 was not a series of accidents. It was the most rational demonstration of what a system can do to its people when it becomes clogged and mired in a quagmire of debt. At Ageless Finance, we believe that ownership is not just a number, but the most fundamental issue of individual liberty. Knowing history is not about merely sifting through dusty pages. It is about acquiring a compass to avoid the financial traps of the future. When you wake up one morning in a world where your own labor and savings have been declared illegal, the only true assets you will possess will be your knowledge, your awareness, and your auto-system preparedness. Protect your assets, grasp the inner workings of the system, and never forget how much your right to property currently requires permission. History is written by the victors, but it only protects those who are prepared and those who play the game, not by its rules, but by stepping outside of it. In the next episode, we will continue to descend into the deeper and darker corridors of the financial world. Take care of yourselves and your future.